I never imagined I would speak these words out loud. For most of my life, I believed silence was safer, that keeping everything buried would protect me from the shame, the judgment, the fear of being misunderstood. But silence has a way of poisoning the soul. It seeps into every prayer, every quiet moment, and reminds you of the secret you carry. I was only a child when my world was broken, and for decades I tried to convince myself that if I didn't say it, it wasn't real. Yet here, I'm now, as an old woman, finally allowing my voice to tremble into the light. Not because the pain has vanished, it hasn't. Not because the memories have faded, they are sharp as glass even after all these years. But because I know there is someone out there who might need to hear this. Someone who feels just as small, just as voiceless as I once did. If that's you, know this: you are not alone. The story I am about to tell is not one of fairy tales or happy childhood memories. It is the story of betrayal, of nights filled with fear, of secrets I thought would follow me to my grave. And yet, it is also the story of survival, of finding strength I didn't know existed, of discovering that even in the darkest valley, there are glimmers of grace. I grew up in a modest American town, the kind where church bells marked the rhythm of our days and neighbors waved from their porches without suspicion. Ours was not a wealthy family, but it was a respectable one. My parents worked hard to give us what they could, and we clung to each other in the way small families do. To everyone looking from the outside, we were ordinary, safe, and blessed. But the most dangerous secrets are often kept in homes that look the most ordinary. There was a man in my life who should have been my protector, my guide, someone I trusted without hesitation. He was kind to others, respected in the community, the sort of relative people praised when they mentioned his name. I remember my mother smiling proudly whenever he came to visit, saying how fortunate we were to have him so involved in our lives. To the world, he was a model of responsibility, the uncle every child would be lucky to have. But behind closed doors, when no one was watching, that mask slipped. And I saw the truth. The first time it happened, I was too young to understand the weight of what was being taken from me. I only knew that something felt wrong, that my body froze in a way it had never done before, that the walls I had known to be safe suddenly became suffocating. I wanted to scream, to call for my mother, but the words lodged in my throat like stones. And afterward, when he looked me in the eyes and told me not to say a word, I believed him. Children believe what they are told, especially when the voice comes from someone they are supposed to trust. From that moment forward, my nights were no longer my own. Even now, so many decades later, I can still remember the creak of floorboards outside my room, the way my small hands clutched the bedsheet, praying for footsteps to pass by, praying to be invisible. But prayers, at least then, went unanswered. And when the door opened, the fear became reality again. I tell you this not to dwell in the horror, but because it explains everything that came afterward. Why I hid, why I doubted myself, why I eventually sought shelter behind the walls of a convent. Those early years were a foundation not of childhood joy, but of fear and silence. I carried the weight alone. You see, when you are betrayed by someone you trust, your world tilts. Right and wrong become blurred. You begin to wonder if somehow it is your fault, if you invited it, if you deserve it. Those were the lies whispered into my young mind, and I swallowed them whole. My uncle didn't have to raise his voice or strike me. his power came from the certainty that no one would believe me, and so I learned how to keep secrets. I learned how to smile at family gatherings, how to bow my head at church, how to laugh when laughter was expected. But inside, I was crumbling. People often ask how a child can keep something so terrible hidden. The truth is, children know when. Love is fragile. They know when telling the truth might break everything apart. And I loved my family too much to risk shattering it. Or at least, that's what I told myself. So I said nothing. For years. And while the silence stretched, so did the pain. Each night was a repeat of the one before. Each day a performance of pretending I was fine. But I was not fine. I was a child drowning in a sea of secrets, gasping for air that never came. Looking back now, I understand the depth of my uncle's betrayal, not only for what he did, but for the way he twisted my innocence into a prison. He convinced me I could never speak, and in some ways, I almost never did. I survived, but at a cost. Even as an old woman, wearing the habit that marks me as a servant of God, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night with that same dread in my chest, that same desperate prayer on my lips. Some wounds never fade entirely, but I have learned that naming them, bringing them into the light, lessens their power, and that is why I am telling you this story. My name is Sister Eleanor Price. I have lived many decades with this secret, and only now, in the autumn of my life, do I feel strong enough to share it openly. My hope is that in telling you, I can finally set down part of the weight I have carried, and maybe, just maybe, someone listening will find the courage to break their own silence. Because the truth is, it was my uncle who broke me, night after night. And because of him, I hid behind the church walls. But what I discovered there was not only shelter, it was the beginning of my healing. When I look back on my earliest years, before the shadows crept in, I can still see flashes of light, moments that remind me I was once just a little girl who believed the world was safe. We lived in a modest house with peeling paint on the porch, and squeaky steps that groaned every time my father came home from work. My mother kept a pot of soup simmering on most days, and no matter how simple the meal was, she always set the table as if company might arrive. I remember the smell of fresh bread cooling on the counter, the sound of hymns drifting through the radio on Sunday mornings, and the way the sun slanted through the lace curtains in our kitchen. Those small things stitched together the fabric of what I thought was a normal childhood. Faith was at the center of everything. Our parish church stood only a few blocks away, its stone walls weathered but proud, the bell tower visible from nearly every street in town. For me, it was the most beautiful place on earth. I loved the echo of footsteps on the wooden floors, the smell of candles burning low, the sight of stained glass windows painting the pews in blues and reds when the sun streamed in. I felt safe there, as though God Himself had stretched His hands across the roof to keep us all sheltered. Sundays were my favorite days. We would dress in our best clothes, my mother in her pressed dress, my father in his worn suit, and me with my hair tied up neatly with a ribbon. After Mass, families would gather outside, talking and laughing, exchanging news about neighbors or work. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat of community, and I belonged to it. And among those faces was my uncle. To everyone, he was a figure of admiration. He worked steadily, attended church faithfully, and had a charm that made people smile. I can still hear my mother's voice saying, "Your uncle is such a blessing, always ready to help, always dependable." And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? He carried himself with the kind of confidence that made children trust him instinctively. He was funny too, often lifting me into the air and spinning me around until I giggled so hard I couldn't breathe. I adored him then, in the way only a child can adore someone who seems larger than life. At family gatherings, he was the one who told the best stories. He'd sit in the living room chair while everyone leaned in, his voice weaving tales that made us laugh or gasp at just the right moments. Sometimes he'd wink at me as if we shared a secret joke, and I'd beam with pride that out of everyone in the room, he noticed me. To a child, attention is a form of love, and I craved it. But as I replay those memories now, with the wisdom of years, I realize how carefully he cultivated that trust, how deliberately he placed himself in the role of protector, entertainer, and friend. Even then, small things stood out, though I didn't understand them at the time. The way his eyes lingered a little too long, the way he found excuses to be near me, the way he would call me his special girl when no one else was listening. Still, none of it seemed wrong back then. To me, he was family. He was safe. I was a quiet child by nature. My brothers were louder, rougher, always outside playing, ball in the street or climbing trees until my mother scolded them for tearing their clothes. I, on the other hand, was happiest with a book or sitting at the kitchen table helping my mother mend seams. She often said I had an old soul, that I carried myself with a seriousness beyond my years. But my uncle brought out another side of me, the side that laughed, that felt noticed, that felt like I mattered. That's what makes betrayal cut so deep. It twists what should be love into something unrecognizable. But in those early years before I understood the danger, I believed. I was safe. My world was built on simple routines: school in the mornings, chores in the afternoons, family dinners at night. My father worked long hours, coming home exhausted, but always with enough energy to lift me onto his knee and ask about my day. My mother tucked me in with prayers whispered softly, her hand smoothing my hair from my forehead. If anyone had asked me then, I would have said my life was blessed. I didn't know the storm that was coming. Sometimes I try to imagine what might have happened if those early days had continued without interruption, if my uncle had remained the kind, protective figure I thought he was. Would I have grown into a different woman? Would my life have taken a path free from so many shadows? I'll never know. What I do know is that the innocence of childhood is fragile, and once it's cracked, it can never be made whole again. The first crack came slowly, almost invisibly. I remember it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It was a warm evening, the kind where the air feels heavy with summer heat. My parents were busy in the kitchen preparing food for guests, and my brothers were outside chasing each other down the street. I was alone in the living room, reading one of my favorite books. That's when my uncle walked in. His voice was light, teasing, the way it always was. He asked what I was reading, ruffled my hair, and sat down beside me. There was nothing alarming in his tone, nothing sharp in his movements. And yet, I felt a small flutter in my chest, a feeling I didn't recognize but couldn't shake. At the time, I brushed it off. I had no reason to doubt him, no reason to fear. But now, when I think back, I realize that moment was the beginning. The shift, the place where innocence began to erode. I didn't know it then, but the man who made me laugh would soon make me cry. And the uncle my mother praised as a blessing would become the nightmare I could never escape. The night that changed everything began like any other. I was still a child, still small enough to believe the world could be trusted, though that belief was already beginning to show tiny cracks. Looking back now, I realize how calculated it all was, how carefully my uncle had chosen his moment. But at the time, I was too naive to see the danger coming. It was an ordinary evening. My parents were busy in the kitchen, my brothers running wild in the yard, their laughter carrying through the open windows. I was left inside, curled up on the couch with a book, content in the safety of my own home. The house smelled of dinner, roasted chicken, garlic bread, the comforting scents that made me feel grounded. Everything about that evening should have been unremarkable, just another thread in the fabric of my childhood. But then he entered the room. His voice was warm, cheerful, teasing as always. He asked what I was reading, leaned down to see the pages, and sat beside me. Nothing in his tone suggested harm. Nothing in his posture gave away the darkness that lurked behind his smile. That's what makes betrayal so devastating. It doesn't arrive with thunder and lightning, but with the soft familiarity of someone you believe you can trust. He began with small gestures, brushing hair from my face, resting his hand too long on my shoulder. At first, I told myself it was nothing. After all, wasn't he family? Wasn't he the one my mother trusted implicitly? I tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in my chest, the way my stomach tightened as though some hidden part of me already knew what was wrong. And then, it happened. I will not recount the details, because some memories are too sharp to be laid bare. What I can tell you is that in that moment, something inside me fractured. My innocence slipped away, stolen before. I even understood what I had lost. I froze. My voice disappeared. My small hands trembled as if bound by an invisible force. And afterward, when he looked at me and spoke in a tone both soft and threatening, I believed every word. He told me I must never say anything, that no one would believe me, that my parents would be devastated if they knew. He carried himself with such certainty that even in my confusion, I accepted his lies as truth. Children believe what they are told, especially when the voice belongs to someone they have been taught to trust. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, praying with all the strength my young heart could muster. I asked God to undo what had happened, to erase it as if it had never been. But the silence that answered was deafening. The prayer didn't change the past, and though I didn't know it then, it wouldn't stop the future from repeating the same nightmare. It wasn't just the act itself that broke me. It was the shift in everything I thought I knew. Suddenly, my home was no longer safe. My uncle's visits, once exciting, became terrifying. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway made my chest tighten with dread. I started flinching at touches, retreating into myself, hiding behind false smiles at the dinner table, but no one noticed. Or perhaps they noticed little things but brushed them off as childhood moods. And so, I learned the art of silence. I learned how to keep my face composed when my uncle walked into the room, how to sit quietly at church while he sang hymns as if he were the most faithful man alive, how to suppress the urge to scream when he patted my head in front of others, disguising cruelty as affection. The world praised him. My family trusted him, and I, small, voiceless, felt trapped in a cage no one else could see. Each incident blurred into the next. Days turned into nights, nights into dread, and still I told no one. My uncle's words echoed inside me. No one will believe you. You'll only bring shame. This is our secret. Those sentences became chains, binding me tighter each time I considered opening my mouth. And so, the fracture widened. School no longer felt like a refuge. I used to love learning, but soon my grades began to slip. Teachers wrote notes home about my distracted behavior, my sudden quietness, my tendency to stare out the window instead of paying attention. But back then, people didn't ask the questions they should have asked. They assumed I was simply daydreaming or that I was shy by nature. In reality, I was living in two worlds, the outer one where I pretended everything was fine, and the inner, one where terror gnawed at me day after day. I remember one afternoon sitting in the church pew with my hands folded tightly, whispering a prayer I had whispered many times before. God, please, make him stop. I thought if I prayed hard enough, if I showed enough faith, maybe God would intervene. But when nothing changed, I began to wonder if God had abandoned me, or worse, if he was punishing me. Children don't have the words for trauma. Instead, they twist the blame inward. And so I began to believe that somehow I was the problem, that I had invited this darkness, that I was dirty, unworthy, unlovable. Those lies became the foundation of my silence. If anyone had asked me then what was wrong, I would have smiled and said nothing. I would have laughed on cue, recited my prayers, and carried on with the performance. But inside, the fracture spread deeper, like a crack in glass slowly spidering outward. And so began the pattern: fear at night, silence by day. Looking back, now I understand that those years taught me how to wear a mask. They taught me how to compartmentalize, how to bury pain beneath layers of obedience and forced cheer. On the outside, I was the dutiful daughter, the quiet student, the polite niece. On the inside, I was screaming, though no sound escaped. That first fracture, that first night, was not an isolated wound. It was the opening of a chasm that would grow wider with each passing day, each whispered threat, each unanswered prayer. And though I didn't know it then, that silence would define my life for years to come. Silence became my constant companion. After that first fracture, words I once spoke freely seemed to vanish. I still chatted with my friends at school, still recited prayers at Mass, still laughed when people expected me to laugh. But when it came to the one truth that consumed my world, I said nothing. I told myself I was protecting my family. My uncle's threats echoed in my mind, his warning that no one would believe me, that my parents would only be heartbroken, that I would be the one to destroy the family if I ever opened my mouth. And I was a child who loved her parents more than life itself. The thought of causing them pain terrified me more than the suffering I endured in silence. So I swallowed my words, one by one, until even the idea of speaking felt impossible. Dinner, I would sit across from my father, watching his tired but kind eyes as he asked us about our day. My brothers rambled on about their games and schoolyard adventures, while I pushed peas around my plate, fighting tears I could never explain. Sometimes I thought of telling him, just blurting it out, right there at the table. But each time, my uncle's voice drowned out my courage. They'll never believe you. You'll ruin everything. And so, I lowered my eyes, smiled faintly, and said nothing. I became skilled at pretending. I wore my silence like armor, though it was armor that cut me from the inside. I learned how to disguise trembling hands by keeping them folded neatly in my lap. I mastered the art of smiling, just enough so no one asked questions. And when I felt tears threatening, I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and let them fall where no one could see. The hardest part was church. Sitting in those pews, staring up at the crucifix, I felt torn between desperation and despair. I prayed harder than ever before, whispering pleas into my folded hands. God, please take this from me. Please make him stop. Please don't let this happen again. But the silence that followed was unbearable. Each unanswered prayer felt like confirmation that maybe God agreed with my uncle, that maybe I really was to blame. Children cannot separate lies from truth when those lies come from someone powerful. And so I absorbed his poison into my own bones, believing that my worth had been stripped away, that I was broken beyond repair. My schoolwork began to slip. Teachers noticed I was quieter, more withdrawn, but they chalked it up to shyness. When I stumbled over simple math problems or forgot to turn in assignments, they scolded me gently, urging me to try harder. They never saw that my mind was elsewhere, trapped in fear, rehearsing what might happen the next time my uncle's footsteps approached. I longed for someone to see through me, to notice the way my smile never quite reached my eyes. But no one did. And so I grew more convinced that I had to keep the secret alone. The silence began to shape me. I stopped asking questions in class, afraid my voice might betray me. I withdrew from my friends, pretending I was too busy or too tired to join their games. I even avoided my mother's gaze when she brushed my hair in the mornings, terrified she might glimpse the truth in my eyes. One night, I tried to tell her. I remember sitting at the kitchen table while she prepared dinner, my small hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the chair. The words were right there, pressing against my lips. Mama, something is happening. Mama, please help me. But when she turned to smile at me, warm and trusting, I couldn't do it. The thought of shattering her happiness was unbearable. So instead, I forced a weak smile and asked if I could help stir the pot. That was the night. I learned silence could feel like betrayal, not just of myself, but of the truth. And yet I kept it. In time, silence became so familiar that it seemed easier than speaking. I convinced myself that if I endured quietly, maybe one day it would end on its own. Maybe he would lose interest. Maybe I would simply grow older and escape somehow. Those fragile hopes kept me going, but silence is not protection. It is a cage. And with each passing day, the walls of that cage closed in tighter. I began to lose pieces of myself. I stopped writing in the little journal my teacher had given me, afraid that if anyone found it, they would uncover my secret. I stopped playing piano in the church hall, even though I once loved the way music filled the air, because the joy felt undeserved. I stopped looking people in the eye, worried they might see the truth written across my face. Silence didn't just keep me hidden, it erased me still. There were moments when the truth clawed its way to the surface, demanding release. Once, during grace at dinner, my voice cracked as tears welled unexpectedly. My father looked at me with concern, asking if I was ill. My brothers teased me for being too emotional. My mother brushed it off, saying I was probably just tired. And once again, I swallowed the words that might have freed me. It's strange, isn't it? How a child can live with such heavy pain and still manage to fool an entire household. I became a master of disguises, though each disguise chipped away at who I really was. Looking back now, I wish I had known that silence was not strength, that speaking would not have made me weak, but brave. But at the time, all I knew was fear. Fear of breaking my family. Fear of being rejected. Fear of not being believed. That fear, that silence, stretched on for years, and with each year that passed, My uncle grew bolder, more certain of his control. My world, already fractured, began to darken even more. I thought silence was my shield. But in truth, it was the very thing that allowed the shadows to grow, and soon those shadows would begin to consume every part of me. The longer my silence lasted, the stronger his grip became. What had started as isolated moments of dread soon grew into a cycle that consumed my entire childhood. It wasn't just the nights that terrified me anymore. It was the days, too. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that fell across a room, every unexpected knock on the door sent my heart racing. Fear became my constant shadow. I began to live in a state of vigilance, always anticipating, always watching. While other children played freely in the streets, I stayed close to the porch, pretending I preferred quiet games, but really needing to keep the house in my sight. I could no longer separate safety from danger, comfort from threat. My uncle had blurred all the lines until nothing felt certain anymore. At family gatherings, his presence was inescapable. He laughed the loudest, told the funniest stories, made himself the center of every room. To the world, he was still the dependable uncle, the man everyone praised. But to me, he was the storm cloud hanging over every holiday meal, every Sunday gathering. His casual touches in front of others seemed harmless to them, but to me, they were silent reminders of the prison I lived in. And still, I said nothing. The silence began to eat away at my spirit. I grew more withdrawn, pulling away from my friends, avoiding eye contact with my teachers. At school, I often sat at my desk, staring at the chalkboard, not absorbing a single word. When called upon, I stumbled, embarrassed, as though I were failing at being both a student and a person. One teacher once asked me to stay after class. She said she noticed I wasn't myself, that my work had slipped, that I seemed sad. For a moment, I felt the words rising to my lips, a desperate cry for help. But then I pictured my uncle's face, his threats echoing in my ears. And I froze. I forced a smile, told her I was just tired, and hurried out the door before she could ask anything more. I often wonder how different my life might have been if I had spoken up then. If that one teacher had pressed a little harder, if I had found the courage to whisper even a fragment of the truth. But the past cannot be undone, and at that time, silence still felt safer than honesty. At home, my parents began to notice changes they couldn't explain. My mother scolded me gently for being distant, for neglecting chores I once completed eagerly. My father asked why I never played outside with my brothers anymore. I offered excuses, lies about being tired or preferring to read. In truth, I was trying to make myself invisible, to shrink so small that maybe the darkness wouldn't find me, but it always did. The escalation wasn't only in his actions, it was in the way he seeped into my very sense of self. I began to believe I was dirty, unworthy of love, beyond saving. I carried guilt that didn't belong to me, wearing it like a cloak I couldn't remove. The more he hurt me, the more I believed it must be my fault. That is the cruelty of such betrayal. It convinces the victim that the blame lies within them, not the one who inflicted the wound. Faith, once my refuge, grew complicated. I still sat in the pew every Sunday, still folded my hands in prayer, but my conversations with God were different. I begged for protection, begged for deliverance, begged for someone, anyone, to see what was happening. And when nothing changed, I began to wonder if God was listening at all. Maybe, I thought, he was punishing me. Maybe I was too broken for his love. Those doubts haunted me more than the silence itself. Because if even God had abandoned me, where could I possibly find hope? By the time I reached my teenage years, the weight of it all was unbearable. I became skilled at wearing masks, but inside I was crumbling. Anxiety gnawed at me daily, nightmares shook me awake at night, and shame clouded every interaction. My laughter disappeared. My joy vanished. Even when surrounded by people, I felt completely alone. The escalation took another form, too. My uncle's boldness grew. He no longer seemed concerned about being caught. He carried himself with confidence, even arrogance, certain that I would never reveal the truth. And sadly, he was right. I remained silent, trapped not only by fear, but by the belief that I had no worth without that silence. Yet, no matter how tightly I clung to my secret, cracks began to show. My friends whispered about how quiet I had become, how I never wanted to stay over at their houses, how I always made excuses to leave early. My family noticed my restlessness, though they couldn't name its source. My mother sometimes caught me staring into space with tears in my eyes and asked softly, "Are you all right, Eleanor?" Every time I nodded, forcing a smile, and every time my heart broke a little more. The years of silence stretched like an endless road. Each day looked the same: fear, pretense, exhaustion. But deep down, something was shifting, though I couldn't see it at the time. The lies I had believed for so long, that I was worthless, that no one would care, that speaking would destroy everything, were beginning to clash with the undeniable truth. I couldn't survive like this forever. I was drowning. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I would hear another voice, faint, fragile, but present. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. That if the truth ever came to light, I might finally breathe again. I didn't yet know how that truth would be revealed. I didn't yet know the cost or the pain it would bring. But the silence I had clung to for so long was beginning to crack, and soon the world around me would see what I had hidden for years. Secrets cannot stay hidden forever. No matter how carefully they are buried, no matter how tightly they are held in silence, the truth has a way of seeping through the cracks. Mine had been buried for years, but the weight of it was beginning to show. By the time I was in my teenage years, I was no longer the bright, eager girl I had once been. My grades had slipped. My laughter was gone. I walked through the halls of school like a shadow, eyes down, shoulders hunched, always trying to disappear. My teachers noticed, though they didn't know what to make of it. Some assumed I was simply shy or distracted. Others gently scolded me for not applying myself. None of them guessed the storm I was carrying inside. But one person did notice. One person refused to look away. It was my English teacher, Mrs. Carver. She had a sharp eye and a soft heart, the kind of woman who seemed to see more than she let on. She began pulling me aside after class, asking how I was doing, reminding me that her door was always open if I ever wanted to talk. At first, I brushed her off with the same excuses I gave everyone. "I'm just tired," or "I've been busy." But she didn't give up. She kept watching, kept asking, and little by little, I began to feel the walls I had built start to tremble. One afternoon, she assigned us an essay on the theme of truth. I remember staring at the blank page, my pen hovering, my hands trembling. The word itself felt dangerous, as though writing it down might unleash everything I had tried to bury. But when I finally began to write, something inside me broke open. I didn't tell the whole story, not directly. Instead, I wrote about a bird trapped in a cage, about how it longed to sing but was silenced by fear. I wrote about the weight of secrets, about the ache of carrying something too heavy for a child's shoulders. It wasn't a confession, not exactly, but it was close enough that Mrs. Carver saw what others had missed. When she returned my paper, she didn't hand it to me in front of the class. Instead, she asked me to stay after. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were steady as she said, "Eleanor, this isn't just a story, is it?" My throat tightened. My palms grew clammy. For a moment, I considered lying, pretending it was just a metaphor, just an assignment. But the compassion in her eyes undid me. Tears spilled before I could stop them. And though I didn't speak the full truth that day, she knew enough. She told me she believed me. She told me I wasn't alone. And for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. Still, speaking the truth aloud was terrifying. I had lived so long under my uncle's threats that the idea of breaking the silence felt impossible. But Mrs. Carver didn't let it rest. She reached out to the school counselor, and soon I found myself sitting in a quiet office with a woman who asked questions I had never been asked before. At first, I resisted. I said, "I'm fine," a dozen times, tried to deflect with vague answers. But eventually, the words slipped out, halting, broken, but real. I told her enough that the pieces began to fit together. Enough that someone finally saw the truth I had carried alone for so long. The discovery didn't come with relief right away. Instead, it came with fear. Fear of what would happen next. Fear of my uncle's reaction. Fear that my family would be shattered by what I revealed. But once the words left my lips, they could not be taken back. The secret was no longer mine to bear alone. When my parents were told, the world I had known shifted forever. I will never forget the look on my mother's face. Shock, heartbreak, disbelief, all tangled together. My father's silence was even heavier. He sat with his hands clenched, his jaw tight, as though every emotion inside him was waging war. For a long time, I thought they might not believe me. My uncle had convinced me of that for years. But when my mother pulled me into her arms and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I'm so sorry," I knew the tide had turned. The days that followed were chaotic, filled with questions, meetings, and hushed conversations I wasn't always part of. Adults moved around me like storm clouds, voices raised, doors slammed, decisions made. I felt both central to everything and invisible at the same time. But beneath the chaos, something had shifted inside me. The silence was broken. The truth had been spoken, and though it was terrifying, it was also the first step toward freedom. For the first time in years, I no longer felt completely alone. Someone had listened, someone had believed me, and that fragile flicker of hope began to grow. But discovery is only the beginning. Truth brings consequences, and the path forward was far from easy. My uncle would not disappear quietly. The scars he left would not heal overnight. And the journey that lay ahead would test me in ways I could not yet imagine. Still, the cage had cracked open, and for the first time I could see a glimpse of light. When the truth finally came into the light, it felt like the world split in two. On one side was the life I had lived for years, silence, fear, and secrecy. On the other was something new, something fragile but real, the possibility of being safe. The first days after my confession were a blur. Adults whispered in corners, phones rang late into the night, and my parents moved through the house like restless ghosts, pacing, murmuring, trying to decide what to do next. My mother's eyes were swollen from crying. My father's face was etched with a rage I had never seen before. For so long I had feared they wouldn't believe me, but now that they did, I realized belief came with its own storm. Because belief demanded action. I was taken to speak with officials, strangers in tidy suits and serious expressions. Their questions were careful, measured, but each one forced. Me to reopen wounds I wanted to keep closed. I answered as best I could, haltingly, with my hands trembling in my lap. They assured me I was brave, that I was doing the right thing. But bravery didn't feel like what I carried inside. What I felt was exhaustion and an overwhelming desire for it all to be over. My uncle was confronted soon after. I wasn't there when it happened, but I still remember the tension in the house the night my father came home from seeing him. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought it might break. He didn't speak a word during dinner, and when I caught his eyes, I saw something fierce there, a vow, unspoken but undeniable, that he would never let my uncle near me again. The family that had once praised my uncle now stood divided. Some relatives refused to believe it. They called me confused, dramatic, even a liar. Those words cut deeply, reopening old fears, making me question myself even after everything I had endured. But my parents, despite their own heartbreak, stood by me. My mother held my hand when I cried, repeating softly, "We know the truth. That's what matters." In the midst of the turmoil, I was taken out of the places where my uncle might reach me. No more family gatherings with him present, no more unsupervised visits, no more silence binding me to his control. It wasn't freedom in its fullness, not yet, but it was the first taste of safety I had ever known. At school, the change was noticeable. Teachers who once only scolded me now offered kindness, extra time, and gentle encouragement. Mrs. Carver, the teacher who first noticed, checked on me daily, her steady presence reminding me that not all adults turned away. She told me something I still carry with me. What happened to you does not define you, Eleanor. What you do now, that is what shapes your life. Those words were like water on parched ground, but rescue was not simple. Even as protections were put in place, the damage lingered. Nights still brought nightmares. Crowds still made me feel exposed. My uncle's voice still echoed in my mind, whispering lies that I wasn't worth saving. Rescue, I learned, was not a single moment, but a process, slow and uneven. The church became a complicated place for me. For years, I had hidden behind its walls, begging God for help that seemed never to come. Now, as the truth began to unfold, I found myself wrestling with my faith in new ways. Part of me wanted to run from it completely, to abandon the prayers that had felt unanswered. But another part of me, small and stubborn, held on to the belief that perhaps God had been with me all along, quietly, invisibly, waiting for this moment of light. It was during one Sunday service that I felt a shift. The hymn rose around me, voices blending in harmony, and for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, not by the congregation, not even by my parents, but by something greater. It was as though God whispered, "You survived, and now you are being delivered." Tears streamed down my face, not of despair this time, but of release. It didn't erase the past, but it gave me courage to believe in a future. Rescue also meant therapy, sitting in quiet rooms with a counselor who gently guided me to speak what I had buried. At first, I resisted. Silence had been my way of life for so long that words felt foreign, heavy on my tongue. But slowly, session by session, I began to let pieces of my truth emerge. And with every word spoken, the chains that bound me grew lighter. My parents, too, began to heal in their own way. My mother often apologized over and over for not seeing sooner. I would tell her it wasn't her fault, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself then. My father grew quieter, more protective, as though he carried guilt alongside his rage. Rescue had freed me from my uncle, but it had also placed a new burden on my family, one they carried with love, but also with pain. Still, amid the chaos and the grief, hope began to take root. I started to imagine a life not defined by fear, but by possibility. A life where I could laugh again, study again, maybe even dream again. Rescue did not erase the scars, but it gave me the space to begin healing. And though the road ahead would be long and winding, I knew one thing with certainty. The silence that once imprisoned me had been broken. The truth was out, and it had set me free. But freedom is not the same as wholeness. That journey, the journey of healing, was only just beginning. Healing is not a straight path. It is not a single moment of triumph where everything suddenly becomes whole again. Healing, I learned, is messy. It is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It is finding light in one moment and stumbling into shadows in the next. In the weeks after my rescue, I thought freedom would bring immediate relief. I expected that once my uncle was gone from my life, the nightmares would vanish, the fear would dissolve, and joy would return easily. But trauma leaves echoes, and those echoes do not fade quickly. Nights were still the hardest. I would wake drenched in sweat, my heart racing, certain I could hear footsteps outside my door. It took time, and many tearful conversations with my mother, before I could even sleep with the light turned off. My counselor reassured me that this was normal, that the body remembers even when the danger has passed. Slowly, through breathing exercises and gentle reassurance, I learned to ground myself in the present, to remind my body that I was safe now. Therapy became both a lifeline and a challenge. Speaking the words aloud was painful. Each session felt like peeling away layers of a wound that I would rather have kept bandaged. But beneath the pain, something new was growing, understanding. My counselor helped me see that what happened was not my fault, that the shame I carried did not belong to me. Hearing those words again and again was like salve on a burn. It didn't heal overnight, but it began to soothe what had once been unbearable. One of the most difficult parts of healing was forgiving myself. For years, I had believed the lies my uncle told me, that I was complicit, that I should have spoken sooner, that I had ruined everything. Those lies had taken root so deeply that even after being believed, I still carried them like stones in my chest. Learning to lay them down was slow work. Journaling became a tool of survival. I filled pages with thoughts I had never dared speak, pouring out anger, sorrow, confusion, and hope in messy handwriting. At first, the words felt jagged, raw, as if I were reliving everything all over again. But over time, those journals became a record of my progress, showing me that even when I stumbled, I was moving forward. Faith, too, played a role in my healing, though not in the way I once imagined. For years, I had begged God for rescue, feeling abandoned when no answer came. After my truth was revealed, I wrestled with that silence. Did God not care? Had he looked away? It was during a retreat at a convent that I began to see differently. Surrounded by women of faith, I witnessed a quiet strength, a kind of peace I longed for. A sister there told me something that changed my perspective. God wept with you, Eleanor. He was not absent in your suffering. He was grieving beside you. Those words pierced me. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that I had not been abandoned, but accompanied. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it offered me a new way to carry it, with less loneliness and more hope. Friendships were harder to rebuild. Many of my peers didn't understand what I had gone through, and I often felt out of place among their carefree conversations. But slowly, I found one or two friends who offered patience, who didn't push me to get over it, but simply sat with me, laughed with me, included me. Their quiet presence was healing in ways they never knew. At home, my family adjusted in their own ways. My mother remained tender, always ready with a hug or a listening ear. My father became fiercely protective, sometimes too much so, hovering in ways that made me feel trapped again. We argued at times, each of us carrying our own wounds, but beneath it all was love. Love determined to outlast the damage. Healing was also about rediscovering myself. I began to play piano again, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Music became my sanctuary, a place where I could pour out emotions too deep for words. I also returned to writing, not just in journals, but in stories and poems, finding a way to transform pain into something meaningful. There were setbacks, of course, days when the weight of it all returned, when I questioned whether I would ever truly be whole. But in those moments, I learned to be gentle with myself. Healing, I realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it without letting it define me. The greatest lesson of that season was this: brokenness does not mean the end of a story. Brokenness can be the place where rebuilding begins. Looking back, I see how each step of healing was laying a foundation for something larger, a purpose I could not yet see, but one that would eventually call me forward. For now, I was still learning to breathe freely, still learning to trust, still learning to hope. But beneath the fragile surface of my recovery, something strong was taking root. And soon, that strength would guide me toward a new calling, one that would turn my pain into service, my wounds into witness, my silence into a voice for others. For a long time, healing felt like the only goal: to survive, to breathe, to make it through another day without drowning in memories. But as the years passed, I began to feel something shift. Healing was no longer just about surviving. It was about discovering why I had survived. The question that lingered in my heart was simple but powerful. What now? I didn't want my life to be defined solely by what had been taken from me. I wanted it to mean something more. I wanted to transform the ashes of my childhood into something that could give light to others. At first, I wasn't sure what that meant. I tried different paths: volunteering at shelters, tutoring younger children, helping with community programs. Each experience touched me, but none of them quite felt like home. Yet in every act of service, I sensed a whisper of something greater, calling me forward. It was during a church retreat one summer that clarity began to form. Surrounded by quiet gardens, candlelight, and the steady rhythm of prayer, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I listened to the stories of women who had devoted their lives to faith, service, and compassion. Their words were not dramatic or lofty. They were simple, grounded, yet filled with purpose. I remember one sister sharing, "When God restores what was broken, He doesn't just return it to what it was. He transforms it into something new, something that carries life for others." Those words settled deep in my soul. I realized my life didn't have to be a monument to pain. It could be a testimony of transformation. Slowly, the idea of religious life began to take root. At first, I resisted it. The thought of becoming a nun felt overwhelming, almost unreal. Could someone as scarred as me truly belong in a life of faith and service? Could I really dedicate myself wholly when I still carried so many wounds? But the more I prayed, the clearer it became. My scars were not disqualifications. They were part of my calling. They gave me a unique compassion, a unique voice for others still trapped in silence. The decision didn't happen overnight. I spent years discerning, talking with mentors, praying deeply, and testing whether this was truly the path for me. My family, though surprised at first, supported me. My mother wept when I told her, not from sadness, but from a mixture of pride and awe. My father nodded quietly, as though he had always known I would find a way to turn pain into purpose. Entering the convent was both terrifying and liberating. I remember walking through the gates with trembling hands, carrying only a small suitcase, wondering if I was truly ready. But when I was welcomed by the sisters, women of different ages and stories, yet united in devotion, I felt something I had longed for: belonging. Life there was simple yet profound. Days began with prayer, continued with service, and ended with reflection. I found joy in the rhythm, in the small acts of kindness that filled each hour. I learned to laugh again, quietly at first, then more freely. For the first time in years, I felt not just safe, but whole. Of course, even in the convent, the past didn't vanish. My memories still visited me, sometimes harshly. But within those walls, I discovered tools to face them: silence that soothed, prayer that strengthened, community that held me up when I faltered. In time, I took my vows, becoming Sister Eleanor Price. The name felt like a rebirth, a step into the life I was meant to live. Standing there, clothed in simple garments, I felt the weight of my past and the light of my future converge. My story was no longer just one of suffering. It was one of resilience, faith, and purpose. From that point forward, my mission became clear. I would use my voice for those who still felt voiceless. I would listen to the broken, the silenced, the forgotten. I would remind them, as I had been reminded, that their story was not over, that healing was possible, that they were not alone. Sometimes, when I speak to young women who carry their own hidden wounds, I see in their eyes the same fear and shame I once carried. And when I tell them, I understand, I mean it with every fiber of my being. My past, though painful, allows me to reach them in ways no one else can. That is the gift hidden in the ashes. Purpose, I learned, is not about erasing the past. It is about redeeming it. It is about allowing what once threatened to destroy you to become the very thing that strengthens and guides you. Now, as I reflect on those years, I see how every step, every tear, every prayer, every moment of silence, and every cry for help was leading me here, to this life, to this calling. But my story is not finished. Healing and purpose are ongoing journeys, And the greatest chapter, the one where I share my story not as a confession of pain, but as a testimony of hope, is still unfolding. When I look back over the long road of my life, it feels almost impossible to believe that the girl I once was and the woman I have become are the same person. That frightened child who carried a terrible secret thought she would never be free. She thought silence would be her prison forever. But God, in His quiet, persistent mercy, had other plans. My uncle broke me night after night. Those words are painful even now, though they sit differently on my tongue than they once did. For years they defined me. They were the shadow that followed me everywhere, shaping how I saw myself, how I trusted others, how I prayed. I hid behind the church walls, not because they felt holy at first, but because they felt safe. They were the only place I could breathe. But what I did not know then was that those same walls, which once held my fear, would later shelter my healing. What began as a hiding place became a home. What began as a desperate refuge became the foundation of my calling. I have lived many years now as Sister Eleanor Price, and in those years I have walked with countless others who carry their own hidden wounds. Some have been young women just like I was, confused, afraid, and silent. Others have been older, holding secrets for decades, convinced that it was too late to begin again. To each one, I have said the same truth. It is never too late. Healing is always possible. There is a tendency to think that survival means the end of the story, but survival is only the beginning. Healing takes time. Purpose takes time. Forgiveness takes even more time. And sometimes, forgiveness is not about excusing the harm done. It is about releasing yourself from the chains of bitterness. For me, forgiveness has been a journey. I do not excuse my uncle's cruelty. I do not pretend it did not wound me. But I choose not to let that wound be the final word. Faith has carried me through, though I will admit, it has not always been steady. I have doubted, I have wept, I have raged at God in the silence of my room. But through it all, I have discovered something truer than I ever imagined. God does not abandon us in our suffering. He weeps with us. He carries us when we cannot walk on our own. He transforms even the most broken pieces into something new. If you are listening to my story today, perhaps you carry your own secret. Perhaps you know too well the weight of silence, the fear of being disbelieved, the ache of wondering if you will ever feel whole. To you I say this: you are not alone. Your worth is not defined by what was done to you. Your story is not finished, and your life is not beyond redemption. I once thought I would never laugh again, never trust again, never dream again. But I was wrong. I laugh now, sometimes loudly, sometimes softly, but always with gratitude. I trust, carefully, but deeply. And I dream, not of escaping my past, but of using it as a lantern for others who walk in darkness. The church walls I once hid behind are no longer walls of fear. They are walls of sanctuary. Within them, I found God's quiet voice, and within them, I found myself. My vow as a nun is not simply a vow of service, it is a vow of testimony. Every prayer I whisper, every hand I hold, every tear I wipe away is part of my redemption story. I do not share this to invite pity. I share it because silence almost destroyed me, and I will not let silence destroy another soul if I can help it. Speaking is hard. Believing you are worthy is hard. But both are possible. If there is one lesson my journey has etched into me, it is this. Brokenness does not disqualify you from love, from hope, from purpose. Brokenness can become the very soil where new life grows. As I sit here now, years removed, from those nights of terror, I can say with honesty, I am not the same girl who once trembled in the dark. I am a woman transformed, a woman redeemed, a woman with a voice. My scars are still with me, but they are no longer chains. They are markers of survival, symbols of grace, proof that even in the deepest night, dawn can come. So if you are hearing my voice, let my story remind you, no matter how deep the wound, no matter how heavy the silence, no matter how lost you feel, healing is possible. Light will find you. And when it does, you too can step out from behind the walls that once hid you and walk boldly into the life waiting ahead. This is my story. Pain and silence, truth and rescue, healing and purpose. And now, peace.